For more than 50 years, Nancy Guthrie lived in the same home in Tucson, Arizona. The same neighborhood, the same routines, the same quiet rhythm that eventually becomes invisible to the outside world, because nothing about it seems unusual anymore. That may be one of the reasons this case feels so unsettling. Not because an 84-year-old woman disappeared, as tragic as that already is, but because she disappeared from the exact place that should have been safest to her. A home she knew better than anyone else. A place where every light switch, every hallway, every creaking floorboard belonged to memory and routine. And yet sometime during the early morning hours of January 31st, that sense of safety appears to have collapsed completely. Before we go any further, this video is not about accusing anyone. It is not about internet theories or naming suspects without evidence. This case is still active. No arrests have been announced. No one has been charged. What we are doing here is something different. We are looking carefully at the timeline, the publicly discussed evidence, and the behavioral patterns experts believe may matter. Because the deeper you go into this case, the harder it becomes to ignore one uncomfortable possibility. This may not have been the kind of crime it first appeared to be. Nancy Guthrie was not living an isolated life hidden from the world. Many people knew her through family, church, community, or routine daily interactions. She was also the mother of Savannah Guthrie, the NBC Today Show anchor, which brought national attention to the investigation almost immediately after her disappearance became public. But behind the headlines was a woman whose life had become physically fragile. According to publicly discussed information in the case, Nancy had a pacemaker. She required medication. Authorities indicated she struggled with mobility and could not comfortably travel long distances on foot. That matters because from the beginning, investigators appeared to believe she did not simply wander away from home on her own. And when you look at the timeline, it becomes easier to understand why. The evening reportedly began normally. Nancy spent time with family. She had dinner with her daughter Annie and son-in-law Tommaso. Nothing about the night appeared alarming. No reported signs of distress. No known argument. No indication that anything catastrophic was about to happen. Later that night, Tommaso reportedly drove Nancy home and watched her go inside. That detail matters more than it first seems, because in missing person cases, investigators often begin with one basic question: when was the victim last confirmed safe? In Nancy's case, according to the publicly discussed timeline, she was seen entering her home alive. After that, the story becomes darker. Hours later, sometime after 1 a.m, a figure appeared outside the house. Security footage reportedly captured someone standing on Nancy Guthrie's porch, wearing a mask and gloves. The person did not appear frantic. They did not appear rushed. One of the strangest details, discussed later by analysts, was how calm the individual seemed while approaching the home. Not running, not hesitating, not acting like someone terrified of being caught. And then another detail entered the story. A detail that transformed this case from a normal missing person investigation into something much harder to explain. Nancy's pacemaker reportedly recorded a sudden spike in cardiac activity around the same time the figure appeared outside. Think about that for a moment. A machine inside her body may have documented the exact moment fear entered the house. No witness heard her scream publicly. No one can tell us what she saw. But according to the timeline discussed by investigators and analysts, her heart reacted sharply during those critical moments. Then, later in the night, the pacemaker signal reportedly stopped transmitting altogether. Silence. That silence has haunted this investigation ever since. At first glance, it might sound like the beginning of a random home invasion story. A masked stranger approaches a vulnerable elderly woman's home in the middle of the night. But as investigators and outside experts began examining the details more closely, cracks started appearing in that explanation. Because random crimes usually leave behind a motive that makes immediate sense. Money, sexual violence, a rushed burglary, a visible struggle, something. But according to the publicly discussed details of this case, the scene did not fully support those kinds of explanations. And that is where this story begins to shift from a frightening mystery into something potentially more calculated. The question is no longer just who was outside Nancy Guthrie's house that night. The question becomes something more disturbing. What if the scene was designed to make people look in the wrong direction? And to understand why some investigators and behavioral analysts started asking that question, we have to go back to the exact timeline of what happened between the porch camera, the pacemaker signal, and the final electronic trace connected to Nancy Guthrie's disappearance. The timeline in the Nancy Guthrie case is unusually precise for a missing person investigation. That is one reason the case has captured so much attention. Most disappearances leave investigators struggling to establish basic movement. In this case, technology may have documented several critical moments almost minute by minute. But the clearer the timeline became, the stranger the case started to look. According to the publicly discussed sequence of events, Nancy returned home around 9:48 that evening after dinner with family. By all accounts, nothing appeared unusual. There were no publicly known reports of panic, fear, or conflict. The house was quiet. Then the early morning hours arrived. At approximately 1:47 a.m., surveillance footage reportedly captured a masked figure outside Nancy's home. The person appeared prepared. Gloves, covered face, backpack. Some reports described what looked like a firearm. The individual allegedly approached the porch camera and covered part of the lens using foliage from a nearby plant. That detail matters for two reasons. First, it suggests awareness of the camera system. Second, it suggests the person was thinking ahead. But here is where the timeline becomes difficult to ignore. Around the same time the figure appeared outside, Nancy's pacemaker reportedly recorded a sudden increase in cardiac activity. Investigators and analysts have discussed this moment repeatedly because it creates a chilling possibility. If the timing aligns the way authorities believe it might, Nancy may have become aware of something frightening while that individual was outside or entering the home. Her own body may have reacted before anyone else knew anything was wrong. That is not speculation invented online. It comes directly from the unusual presence of medical telemetry in the case. Very few investigations involve a device inside the victim's body, potentially recording physical distress in real time. And then came another moment investigators could not easily explain away. At approximately 2:28 a.m., the pacemaker reportedly stopped transmitting data to its monitoring system. No further signal, no continued readings, just silence. To many observers, that became one of the most emotionally haunting details in the entire case, because it created the feeling of a clock suddenly stopping. Not metaphorically, electronically. But the timeline may not end there. Roughly 8 minutes later, another surveillance camera located miles away reportedly captured a vehicle traveling south. Some reports suggested the vehicle resembled a Kia Soul moving in the direction of the Mexican border. Authorities have been careful publicly. A vehicle resembling another vehicle is not the same thing as a confirmed identification. But the timing naturally drew attention. And this is where an important distinction must be made. A timeline can show sequence. it cannot automatically prove meaning. That distinction matters because true crime audiences often fall into a dangerous trap. Once people see several suspicious details lined up together, the human brain starts treating probability like certainty. But investigators cannot do that. They need evidence that survives scrutiny in court, not just online speculation. Still, the timeline raises difficult questions. If Nancy could not comfortably travel long distances alone, how did she disappear without a clear trace? If this was a burglary, why does the behavior outside the home appear so controlled? If this was a spontaneous crime, why did the individual seem prepared for surveillance? And perhaps the biggest question of all, why has the case reportedly lacked some of the signs investigators usually expect in crimes driven by obvious motives? That question became central when forensic psychologist Dr. Gary Brucato began publicly discussing the case. Before looking at what he believed may have happened, he reportedly approached the investigation by eliminating explanations that did not appear to fit the known evidence. Not because he claimed certainty, but because behavioral analysis often works by narrowing probabilities rather than proving absolutes. According to his publicly discussed analysis, one of the first possibilities he reportedly rejected was a sexually motivated attack. That part of the discussion became controversial online because people naturally assume a masked intruder entering a home at night must fit certain familiar crime patterns. But Brucato reportedly argued that the known details did not align with the behavioral structure usually seen in sexually motivated offenses. There were reportedly no publicly known signs supporting that type of motive. No pattern of similar crimes connected to elderly victims in the area. No obvious fantasy-driven behavior. No evidence publicly discussed suggesting the kind of repetitive offender pattern typically associated with those crimes. Then came another possibility investigators and analysts reportedly examined: robbery. At first, robbery sounds plausible. Elderly woman, quiet neighborhood, vulnerable target. But according to the publicly discussed details of the scene, something critical appeared missing. A robbery usually produces evidence of theft: cash missing, jewelry gone, valuables taken, something that explains risk versus reward. But reports surrounding Nancy's home suggested that important valuables remained untouched. If accurate, that creates a major behavioral contradiction, because entering an occupied home at night is an extremely high-risk crime. People generally do not accept that level of risk without a clear payoff. And if neither sexual motive nor straightforward theft fully explains the scene, the case begins moving into a much narrower category of possibilities. That is the moment where this investigation starts becoming psychologically unsettling rather than simply mysterious. Because once the obvious motives begin disappearing, attention naturally shifts toward a more uncomfortable idea. What if the real motive was not inside the house at all? What if the motive was Nancy herself? And according to the analysis discussed publicly, that possibility may connect directly to one statistic that changed the way many people started viewing this case altogether. There is one number that appears again and again whenever experts discuss homicide statistics in the United States: 92%. The exact percentage varies depending on the database and methodology being referenced, but the broader conclusion remains remarkably consistent across decades of criminal research. Most homicide victims knew the person responsible in some capacity. Not always intimately, not always family, not always close friends, but somewhere in their orbit. A neighbor, a former employee, a contractor, a caregiver, a customer. Someone seen often enough to become familiar. That statistic became a major turning point in how many people interpreted the Nancy Guthrie case. Because according to the publicly discussed analysis from Dr. Gary Brucato, once you begin eliminating motives commonly associated with stranger crimes, the possibility of prior connection becomes harder to dismiss. Again, that does not identify a suspect. It does not accuse family members. It does not prove conspiracy. But it changes the direction of the question. Instead of asking, why would a stranger target Nancy Guthrie? Investigators may begin asking, who had meaningful access to her life, routine, or vulnerabilities? That difference matters enormously, and it becomes even more important when you examine the behavior of the person captured outside the house. One of the most discussed details in the case is how calm the individual reportedly appeared on camera. Not theatrical, not panicked, not chaotic. Controlled. According to behavioral analysts, stress usually leaks out physically during crimes. Even experienced offenders tend to rush, glance around repeatedly, move erratically, or display visible anxiety. The human nervous system is difficult to fully suppress under pressure. But in this footage, according to those who analyzed it publicly, the figure seemed strangely composed. That observation led to discussions about something called a blunted fear response. This is where conversations around psychopathic traits entered the case. That term is often misunderstood online. People hear the word psychopath and immediately picture movie villains or serial killers. In reality, forensic psychology uses the term more narrowly to describe certain personality patterns: reduced empathy, manipulative behavior, shallow emotional response, and diminished fear reactions under stress. Importantly, discussing psychopathic traits does not diagnose anyone from a video clip. Real diagnosis requires extensive clinical evaluation. But behavioral analysts sometimes examine whether observed conduct resembles patterns documented in criminal research. And, according to Brucato's publicly discussed interpretation, the calmness of the figure outside Nancy's home raised questions about whether the individual was unusually comfortable with risk or intimidation. But then the case presented a contradiction. Because while the figure appeared calm, some of the behavior reportedly looked oddly amateurish. That combination fascinated analysts. Prepared enough to conceal identity, aware enough to interfere with the camera, yet still visible on camera at all. Some reports discussed possible mistakes involving equipment placement or weapon handling. Analysts also questioned why someone supposedly sophisticated would allow themselves to be recorded so clearly in the first place. And that contradiction may be one of the most important behavioral clues in the entire case. Because highly organized offenders usually minimize exposure aggressively. They scout surveillance systems, avoid visible approaches, limit trace evidence, reduce unnecessary risk. But according to the public discussion surrounding this footage, the person outside Nancy's home appeared both confident and imperfect at the same time. Comfortable with intimidation, not necessarily skilled at operational execution. That distinction led Brucato toward one of the most debated ideas connected to this investigation: the possibility that the person visible on camera may not have been the true architect of the crime. In one of the most memorable frameworks discussed publicly, he compared the visible individual to a waiter, not the chef. The waiter carries out instructions. The chef designs the meal. It is a simple analogy, but it resonates because it reflects something investigators often encounter in organized crimes. The visible participant is not always the person with the deepest motive. Sometimes, the most important individual never appears at the scene at all. According to this framework, the person outside the house could theoretically represent the operational layer, the physical presence, the intimidation factor, the person willing to carry out dangerous tasks. But behind that individual, Brucato suggested there could potentially be someone more socially functional, someone who appeared trustworthy. Someone who understood Nancy's routines, habits, or circumstances well enough to help plan the event without attracting suspicion. And this is where the emotional tone of the case changes completely. Because random violence is terrifying in one way, but violence connected to familiarity is terrifying in another. A stranger breaking into a home feels chaotic. Someone operating within a victim's social orbit feels calculated. That distinction may explain why so many people remain deeply unsettled by this investigation months later. The case does not simply raise fears about crime. It raises fears about access. Who knew enough? Who observed enough? Who understood Nancy's vulnerabilities closely enough to exploit them? And perhaps most importantly, who would benefit from making the crime look random? That last question became central to another theory publicly discussed in connection with the investigation: the possibility that parts of the scene may have been staged. Because according to some analysts, one detail continues to stand out above all others. The scene appeared to suggest a stranger crime, but the motive structure reportedly did not fully support one. And that gap between appearance and motive may be where the most important answers are hiding. In modern criminal investigations, DNA has changed something fundamental. It has changed the meaning of time. There was a period when offenders could realistically believe that if they avoided immediate arrest, they might escape forever. Evidence degraded, witnesses forgot details, physical trails disappeared. But forensic science no longer works the way it once did. Today, a single hair, a touch sample, a partial biological trace, or a mixed DNA profile can continue speaking years after a crime occurred. Quietly, patiently, waiting for technology, databases, or investigative methods to catch up. And according to the publicly discussed details of the Nancy Guthrie case, that may be one reason some experts believe the investigation still has a strong possibility of eventually reaching answers. Reports surrounding the case indicated that investigators recovered multiple forms of potential biological evidence connected to the scene. Among the items publicly discussed were mixed DNA samples, a hair reportedly discovered inside the home, and a glove allegedly recovered miles away from Nancy's residence. On the surface, those details sound straightforward. But forensic analysts consistently warn that DNA work is rarely fast, especially in complex cases involving multiple contributors or degraded material. Mixed DNA is particularly difficult because laboratories are not simply identifying one person. They may be trying to separate overlapping genetic profiles from several individuals, while ensuring the final interpretation can withstand scrutiny in court. That process can take months, sometimes much longer. And that delay often frustrates the public, because silence from investigators creates the impression that nothing is happening. But according to experts who discussed this case publicly, silence can sometimes mean the exact opposite. Complex investigations frequently move slowly because authorities are attempting to build something stronger than suspicion. They are attempting to build certainty. One of the most significant developments publicly associated with modern cold case investigations is genetic genealogy. Many people first became familiar with the technique after the arrest of the Golden State Killer, where investigators reportedly used genealogical databases to narrow DNA evidence toward a specific family line decades after the crimes occurred. The process changed criminal investigations permanently. Instead of relying only on existing criminal databases, investigators could potentially compare unidentified DNA against voluntary family submissions uploaded to genealogy services. A suspect no longer needed to be in the system personally. Sometimes, a distant cousin was enough to begin constructing a family tree. That matters enormously in cases where traditional investigative methods stall. And according to publicly discussed reporting connected to the Nancy Guthrie investigation, forensic genealogy experts were reportedly involved in reviewing evidence related to the case. If true, that detail may be more important than many people realize, because behavioral analysis can suggest possibilities. Surveillance footage can establish movement. Timelines can narrow windows. But DNA has the potential to place a real human being physically inside the evidentiary structure of the crime. That is the difference between theory and prosecutable direction. Still, even DNA evidence carries limitations. A genetic profile does not automatically explain motive. It does not automatically prove murder. It does not automatically establish timing. Defense attorneys challenge contamination risks, transfer explanations, and contextual interpretation constantly in modern courtrooms. That is why investigators cannot simply rush public announcements every time a new laboratory result appears, especially in a case as visible as this one. Because once authorities move publicly, they lose something important: control. And according to many experienced investigators, maintaining control of information is often critical in active cases involving potential conspiracies or multiple participants. That idea leads to another detail many people outside law enforcement misunderstand. The absence of public updates does not necessarily mean the absence of investigative progress. In fact, some analysts argue the opposite can be true. When authorities release very little information, it sometimes indicates they are protecting details known only to investigators and whoever committed the crime. Those unreleased details become strategic tools later. Interview pressure points, verification mechanisms, ways to distinguish genuine confessions from false ones, ways to expose contradictions between accomplices, ways to identify who actually possesses insider knowledge. And according to publicly discussed expert opinions surrounding the Nancy Guthrie investigation, there may still be significant evidence the public has never seen. That possibility matters because internet discussion often creates the illusion that the entire case file is already available online. It is not. The public sees fragments. Investigators see the full architecture. They see forensic reports, interview records, digital extractions, behavioral timelines, financial records, communications, surveillance mapping, and laboratory findings that may never become public unless charges are filed. Which means the public conversation around this case may still be missing critical context. And yet, despite all the forensic analysis, all the psychological profiling, all the theories surrounding staging and motive, one reality continues to define the emotional center of this story. Nancy Guthrie was a real person. Not just evidence, not just headlines, not just a mystery discussed online. She was a mother, a grandmother, a woman who spent decades building routines that probably felt permanent until one night shattered them completely. That human reality is easy to lose once a case becomes consumed by theories. But in many ways, it is the most important part. Because behind every timeline is a family waiting for a phone call. Behind every DNA test is someone hoping for an answer they may also fear hearing. And behind every unresolved investigation is a deeper question that true crime audiences sometimes forget to ask. What does justice actually look like in a case where certainty may arrive long after the damage can never be undone? That question may ultimately define the legacy of the Nancy Guthrie investigation more than any theory ever could. Cases like this often create two different stories at the same time. The first story is the public story. The headlines, the surveillance images, the theories repeated online. The visible pieces people debate endlessly across television segments, YouTube channels, forums, and social media threads. But then there is the second story, the private one, the story lived by the family. And sometimes that second story is the part the public understands the least. Because for investigators, a case file is evidence. For viewers, it becomes mystery. But for a family, it becomes time. Time measured differently after someone disappears. Time divided into before and after. Before the phone stopped ringing normally. Before every unknown number became emotionally dangerous. Before every update from law enforcement carried equal parts hope and dread. That reality matters in the Nancy Guthrie case because the public attention surrounding the investigation has been unusually intense from the beginning. Partly because of the strange details, partly because of the behavioral analysis, and partly because Nancy's daughter, Savannah Guthrie, is a nationally recognized television figure. But visibility cuts both ways. Attention can help keep pressure on a case. It can also create noise. Speculation spreads faster than evidence. People begin connecting dots without context. Online audiences sometimes forget the difference between possibility and proof. That is why cases like this require discipline, not just from investigators, from audiences too. Because one of the most dangerous things in modern true crime culture is the illusion of certainty. A person watches enough videos, hears enough theories, and eventually starts feeling as though they know exactly what happened. But real investigations rarely unfold cleanly. Witnesses misremember, timelines shift, early assumptions collapse, forensic evidence changes direction, and sometimes the most convincing theory turns out to be wrong. That does not mean analysis has no value. It absolutely does. Behavioral frameworks, forensic timelines, and investigative reconstruction can all help the public understand why certain possibilities matter more than others. But responsible analysis must leave room for uncertainty, especially in a case where no public arrest has been made. That balance is important because the Nancy Guthrie investigation touches something psychologically powerful for many viewers: trust. At the center of this case is a fear larger than crime itself. The fear that danger may not always come from strangers. The fear that routine can hide vulnerability. The fear that someone can appear normal, helpful, even trustworthy, while carrying motives invisible to everyone around them. That is one reason the case continues resonating months later. It forces people to confront uncomfortable questions about access and familiarity. Who notices the routines of elderly people living alone? Who knows which lights stay on late? Who understands medication schedules, mobility limits, or patterns of isolation? Who quietly learns the geography of another person's life without attracting attention? Those questions are disturbing precisely because they do not require cinematic criminal masterminds. They require proximity, observation, patience. And if the publicly discussed theories surrounding this case are even partially accurate, then the most important clue may never have been the masked figure alone. It may have been the structure of the crime itself. The appearance of randomness surrounding circumstances that allegedly required knowledge. That possibility changes the emotional meaning of the case completely, because random violence creates fear, but targeted manipulation creates betrayal, and betrayal lingers longer. Still, despite all the analysis, the most honest conclusion may also be the simplest one. We do not yet know the full truth. Not publicly. There are details investigators may still be protecting. There may be evidence the public has never seen. There may be interpretations that ultimately prove incorrect. There may be connections still undiscovered. That uncertainty is frustrating, but it is also part of real investigative work. Complex cases do not resolve in 48 minutes like television dramas. DNA testing takes time. Genealogical analysis takes time. Building prosecutable cases takes time. And according to experts who discuss this investigation publicly, that slow process may actually increase the chances of eventual accountability rather than reduce them. Because modern forensic science has changed the landscape permanently. People who once believed they disappeared without trace are being identified decades later. Cold cases are reopening. Unknown DNA profiles are becoming names. Old evidence is learning how to speak again. That does not guarantee resolution in the Nancy Guthrie case, but it does mean silence should not automatically be mistaken for failure. Sometimes, silence means investigators are still listening carefully. Sometimes it means laboratories are still working. Sometimes it means authorities are waiting for one final connection strong enough to survive court, scrutiny, and defense challenges. And sometimes justice moves slowly because certainty matters more than speed. In the end, the most important thing to remember about Nancy Guthrie is not the theories, not the statistics, not even the mystery itself. It is the human reality underneath all of it. An elderly woman went home after dinner with family and never returned publicly again. A pacemaker may have recorded fear in her final known moments. A family continues living inside unanswered questions. And somewhere inside this case, whether through forensic science, witness cooperation, digital evidence, or investigative persistence, the truth still exists. The challenge is not whether the truth exists. The challenge is whether enough evidence can bring it fully into the light. If you have followed this case closely, one respectful question remains worth asking. What detail do you believe investigators consider most important right now? The behavioral evidence, the forensic evidence, or the timeline itself? Share your thoughts carefully and respectfully in the comments. And if you appreciate long-form investigations focused on evidence, psychology, and responsible analysis rather than sensationalism, consider subscribing and following future coverage. Because cases like Nancy Guthrie's deserve patience, accuracy, and attention grounded in humanity rather than noise.